North Korea's Kim Jong-un says the US is rendering the waters near the Korean Peninsula most unstable and heightening the danger of a nuclear war. Now, this is according to the regime's state-run media on this Tuesday. So what is behind the latest hardline rhetoric? And what are the prospects of an all-out confrontation on the peninsula? Meanwhile, has the broader public become inured to North Korea's security threats? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. The recent summit at Camp David among President Yoon Yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and US President Joe Biden has triggered a heated response from North Korea, to say the least. For more on this reality, I have Professor Kim In-han from Ewha Womans University here in the studio. Professor Kim, it's a pleasure to have you here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me today.
I also have Dr. Bruce Bennett at RAND Corporation live on the line. Dr. Bennett, as always, welcome.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Right. Professor Kim, will start here. Now, prior to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's denunciation of the leaders of South Korea, the US and Japan, I believe the local media claimed he called them gang bosses. Prior to that, we had North Korea pledging to take an overwhelming and preemptive action against the Trilateral alliance. What overwhelming and preemptive action do you envision by North Korea?
So when Pyongyang vowed to take an overwhelming and preemptive action against Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington, it refers to the use of nuclear weapons as an option. In other words, they will contemplate to use nuclear weapons in case they feel threatened, and leadership threatened, and regime threatened. So we need to recall that Pyongyang has adopted arguably the most aggressive nuclear doctrine, enabling the use of nuclear weapons in offensive and preemptive manner. Then question is, why Pyongyang responded to the Trilateral summit and recently to the President Yoon in this belligerent rhetoric? So in order to answer that question, we should start from what the leaders of the US, Japan, and South Korea agreed last week at the Trilateral summit at Camp David. Among many agreements they made, security issues stand out, particularly in response to growing military threats from North Korea. They decided to consult each other immediately when a security threat surfaces. And they also decided to conduct a joint military exercise annually. It is a huge move, given the fact that Seoul and Tokyo did not even talk each other for months. So now Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington venture into a new chapter in their relations. So they are all winners of the summit, as they all have something to gain from the promoted security cooperation among them. The security cooperation among the three is anathema to Pyongyang. For Pyongyang, it is a nightmare, because Pyongyang feels more threatened and it feels more isolated as security ties grow stronger among Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington. So it should not be a surprise when Pyongyang criticized the Trilateral summit last week very strongly.
Right, and adding on to what Professor Kim here in the studio has said, Dr. Bennett, North Korea called the recent Camp David summit an Asian version of NATO. How do you respond?
Well, that's really not what it was. The U.S. has a bilateral alliance with South Korea. The U.S. has a bilateral alliance with Japan. The Trilateral summit was an overlay on top of that. It is not a commitment of Japan to support South Korea in a conflict. It's not a commitment of South Korea to support Japan. That's what NATO is. So this is really very different. This is saying if North Korea starts being aggressive in this region, all three of our countries need to be prepared, because North Korea could choose to attack any or all of us. And in that kind of case, we need to coordinate our efforts to minimize the damage that North Korea can cause. This is purely a defensive approach, not an offensive approach that Kim would like to make it appear, because let's face it, he's got serious internal problems, food, energy, and other things. And he's got to divert the attention of his people, and he's trying to do that with this kind of measure.
Right, and as part of efforts to divert attention away from domestic woes, North Korea's Defense Minister Kang Sun-nam, I believe, also touched upon the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, claiming, Professor Kim, that a similar confrontation could occur here on the Korean Peninsula. That being said, what are your thoughts on the prospects of war here on the peninsula?
Well, Ukraine and the Korean Peninsula are similar in many ways. Most of all, Ukraine and South Korea compete against autocracy. So Kiev against Moscow, Seoul against Pyongyang. And it is also similar that both Ukraine and South Korea have backup from liberal democracies out there, while Russia and North Korea have support from China. So we can say that Ukraine and the Korean Peninsula are where ideological fault lines, dividing lines, is drawn in world politics today. That said, we can rule out the possibility that something similar with the ongoing military clash in Ukraine can happen on the Korean Peninsula. We are aware that DMZ is the most militarized area in the world, and tension between the South and North has always been high. However, I would like to say that North Korean Defense Minister Kang Sun-nam's recent statement is a hyperbole. South Korea is very different from Ukraine in many ways. For example, the biggest difference is the military alliance. When the war broke out last year in Ukraine, Ukraine didn't have any military ally. Now it has partners to provide military aids and financial aids, but a year ago it just fought alone. And that's kind of one reason why Russia thought that the conquest will be easy and the war will end quickly. But think about South Korea today. We have had allied with the U.S. for the past 70 years, and the alliance with the U.S. grows stronger, and it is stable. So as we can see from the Trilateral summit last week, at the same time we can see the alliance is very healthy, as we can see from the bilateral summit last April. I think the stronger commitment from Washington to extended deterrence is a good example. So the context we have with Ukraine is different. So as long as I would say that war on the peninsula is unlikely, as long as alliance between Seoul and Washington is robust and military cooperation among U.S., Japan, and South Korea remains effective.
Right. So while Professor Kim believes the chances of a warfare here on the Korean Peninsula, that is, are very low, Dr. Bennett, in the case of an actual confrontation here, what response do you envision from the U.S.?
Oh, I expect that the United States would do a massive deployment of forces to the Korean Peninsula. And it highlights the importance of the trilateral discussion. The reality is, because South Korea has limited infrastructure to support such a deployment while it's involved in warfighting with North Korea, we need substantial military support from Japan in order for U.S. forces to deploy to Korea. We need fuel from Japan. We need landing rights in Japan to stage aircraft into Korea. So the Trilateral Summit was in part trying to make sure that we would have this mutual cooperation that is necessary to defend Korea. This is one of the great secrets that the U.S. and South Korea haven't been telling their people very much about. But that support from Japan is absolutely critical. And I think now we have it secured.
And staying with that, Dr. Bennett, so despite Korea's differences with neighboring Japan over history, you do believe that the neighboring country, Japan, will take an active part in supporting South Korea in the case of a warfare on the Korean Peninsula, then?
Oh, I think that's exactly what Japan committed to in the Trilateral Summit. I think that was one of President Biden's purposes, was let's make sure that we have that support that we're going to need, because otherwise putting enough forces in Korea is just going to take too long. And with the downsizing of the South Korean army, this becomes a critical issue of getting enough U.S. forces here very quickly.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Professor Kim, this is a topic we touched upon with our foreign journalists back on Monday, actually. I'm going to ask the same question to you. There was a recent civil defense drill here in the country, which was the first in about 6 years. Now, this defense drill, the civil defense training, triggered quite a bit of concern about the lack of public interest in the potential danger posed by North Korea. What are your thoughts?
So the drill last week was the first one in 6 years. So I'm not surprised that people showed a lukewarm interest in the drill, and many people don't remember what that was. And some people felt kind of disturbed from their routine life. Honestly, I have some experience on the day of the drill. I had an appointment at my work, so somebody from Vietnam was supposed to come to my office to visit. But he got stuck in a taxi for an hour because of the drill. I didn't expect that, and then he didn't know about it. So when he came to my office, the meeting was short. He spent he wanted to have kind of long hour, 1 hour appointment in the meeting, but the meeting had to be 30 minutes, 20 minutes. So I felt sorry about it. So the drill caused some inconveniences for sure. But we should remember that North Korea's nuclear threat is real. So it has already been long since North Korea has placed the entire southern Korea under the range of its nuclear strike. So we don't have much time in case of contingency. So people need to know in advance where they have to go and what they have to do for their survival, for their life, in case North Korea launches weapons of mass destruction. So we need such a drill regularly, though not frequently. And I think it is a job of South Korean government to promote awareness among people for the importance of the drill.
Right, of course. And broadly speaking, Dr. Bennett, do you suppose that the greater international community itself has perhaps become more inert to North Korea's rampant security threats?
Oh, I think they have to a certain extent. The U.S. and South Korea haven't reacted as strongly as I would have expected them to. Think of last year when North Korea is launching ICBMs and components of ICBMs. I expected the U.S. government to make a major deal of that and to threaten North Korea to stop it and to impose penalties if it didn't, even if they were only bilateral. We didn't do that. We didn't make a big deal out of that action. And when we don't make a big deal, it's hard for the international community to recognize it as a big deal. We also need to be describing to people the potential impacts of nuclear war, and nobody wants to talk about war. Nobody wants to talk about how many lives could be at risk in such a situation. But the reality is we need to help the South Korean people understand how much threat there is out there and what we can do about it, so that there's a willingness to make these efforts, both in drills, but also to support the funding of the Ministry of National Defense and the support of the alliance.
Right, indeed. And Professor Kim, President Yoon Suk-yeol, for his part, though, he has claimed that Pyongyang's persistent provocations will simply serve to perhaps strengthen the three-way partnership among South Korea, Tokyo, Japan, and the U.S. Do you share this view?
So I can't agree more with President Yoon's remark. Pyongyang's provocations have been a major driver of closer relationship among the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. I can give you two examples. First, Pyongyang has made progresses in its nuclear and missile capabilities. Now it has developed capabilities to hit anywhere in the three countries. So with mounting threats from North Korea, Japan, and the United States have to help each other. So cooperation among the three is a must, not an option. So in order to stay safe from possible nuclear attacks from Pyongyang, missile defense should work. And for missile defense to work, early detection and tracking of trajectory are necessary. So that is why real-time intelligence sharing among the three partners is important. And another, so North Korea has worked hard recently to develop a missile launch from submarines. It is because missiles from submarines are difficult to detect. It is why, this is why Seoul has decided to upgrade military cooperation with Tokyo Japan has world-class anti-submarine operations and capabilities. The know-how has been accumulated throughout the Cold War as the United States wanted the Japanese Navy to track and trace Soviet submarines in Northeast Asia. So this is another example of a U.S., ROK, and Japan military partnership goes stronger in response to growing military provocations of North Korea.
Right, and this shared security interest among the three countries, Dr. Bennett, do you see this as potentially diluting broader public concerns over Japan's release of radioactive wastewater from its devastated Fukushima nuclear power plant into the Pacific Ocean starting last week?
Well, I think we have to take a look at that in context. There's been an incredibly strong reaction to that in the international academic literature, saying, well, yes, Japan is releasing a lot of tritium-related radiation, but several Chinese nuclear plants put out 5 to 10 times as much per year themselves. And I think the number was something like 13 plants that do that. So the amount of radiation being put out by China into the East Sea in this case, and into the West Sea, is a significant concern. China's putting out substantial radiation. Sure, Japan is putting out some too, but not nearly as much. So we have to put these kinds of claims by the Chinese in context. The Chinese are also playing an information conflict, trying to influence attitudes in Japan and South Korea, and to break our willingness to work together. We shouldn't let them get away with that.
Right, and also on the national front, Professor Kim, how does Japan's discharge of Fukushima radioactive wastewater look to affect the Yoon administration's efforts to enhance diplomatic ties with Japan?
So I think Japan's discharge of Fukushima radioactive wastewater undermines the Yoon administration's efforts to upgrade ties with Japan. So all the polls indicate that Koreans are not happy with the Japanese government's decision to release the wastewater to the Pacific. But I think it'll be temporary. Japanese government has decided to do so based on science. And we know that an authoritative international organization has concluded that it is safe. And it has also pledged to monitor Japanese activities continuously. So I trust scientific evidence will prevail over misinformation or fake news. But in the short term, the discharge of the treated water will undermine Yoon's approval rate, but it will be back to normal, barring any other political blunders committed by Yoon and his government and party.
Right, and beyond local affairs then, Dr. Bennett, if I were to ask you to rate the level of security tension here on the Korean Peninsula, with 1 being the lowest and 10 being the highest, what number would you choose and why?
Well, I think I would put it around a 6. We don't have a war going on. We don't have a war appearing to be close. In fact, the U.S. intelligence community in June put out a document which said, we don't really expect North Korea to use nuclear weapons in a major offensive against South Korea. What we expect them to do is to do coercive use of nuclear weapons. Maybe not direct attacks, but maybe, and certainly support of North Korean offensive actions, conventional actions, and missile tests and nuclear production with their nuclear weapon threats. This situation is thus not warfare, which would be, in my mind, would be at the top end of that spectrum. But it's also not peace, which would be at the bottom end of the spectrum. I'm concerned that North Korea is trying to create a lot of pressure in the region with its coercive measures. Those coercive measures are not what we want to see going on, because they will make South Korean people, Japanese people, American people very uneasy and won't be feeling peace the way they should be. We need to rein in those North Korean behaviors. North Korea needs to stop producing nuclear weapons. Kim has said they're going to accelerate exponentially that production. That's not peace. And that's not North Korea acting responsibly. North Korea has been using incredible numbers of missile launches. That's not peace. That's, again, coercion. It's an attempt to influence South Korea. So we need to try to rein in those behaviors. That probably means that the U.S. and South Korea need to get a little bit more aggressive in their behavior to influence North Korea. And there are many ways that can be done.
Right. And keeping in mind Dr. Bennett's remarks about how North Korea's hostility has heightened, Professor Kim, I extend the same question to you. How would you rate the level of tension here on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, I don't want to copy Dr. Bennett's the score, but I want to say that still kind of same page. We're on the same page.
6.
I was thinking about, yes, giving 6, because the reason is I don't want to underestimate intention and capabilities of North Korea. It has advanced steadfast manner its kind of nuclear capabilities and missile capabilities, and Korea, Japan, and the U.S. kind of under its target. The missiles target. So we can't underestimate North Korea's intention and capabilities. But one thing we know for sure that is deterrence is working. The allies between the U.S. and Korea is kind of strong and stronger than ever before. And the leaders on both sides, they have trust. And through the multiple meetings for the past few months, the level of the alliance and their commitment to the defense of the Korean Peninsula kind of getting stronger. So I would say that the security kind of environment around the Korean Peninsula is kind of threatening, but not that threatening. So I wouldn't give more than 7 or 8 or 9. Just I would say 6 is kind of optimum number.
Right, a 6 to remind the people that there is a need to be on alert given the tensions on the peninsula then. All right, Professor Kim, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today.
Thank you for having me today.
And Dr. Bennett, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you very much as well.
Right, well, on that note, we end this edition of Issues and Insiders. We return same time tomorrow, that is Wednesday. Do join us then.